Good afternoon, everybody. Now we've had introductions from Chris and Megan, I'll get into the content of today. Why are we here exactly? We're here to talk to you about carbon emissions measurement and reporting. You've heard from Megan, Chris, and I already. I'm going to be setting out the purpose of the session, why we're here. Chris is going to be talking about Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and Megan's going to be talking about measurement and verification of carbon emissions. And then we'll finally have a session, a Q&A session, where you can ask us any questions. The presentation from Chris and Megan should take about 40 minutes in total. That'll leave us with about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. So why are we here? So GemServe, Ramboll and Turner Townsend between us administer the Heat Networks Efficiency Scheme, as you all know. As part of our contractual commitments through winning this work and taking on the administration of the scheme, we've made commitments to social value, which is to help support decarbonisation through the delivery of the HNES contract. And one of the ways we're doing this is to provide applicants to the scheme, which is obviously you guys, with information, advice and guidance on how you can measure and potentially reduce your carbon emissions. So why are we doing this? As I said, it's about helping us to reduce the carbon emissions of the supply chain, particularly around heat networks. To be able to reduce your carbon emissions, you clearly need to measure it. You need to know where you are. You need to know what your baseline is. Also to support the evidencing of carbon reduction achieved over time as part of your businesses and also through the scheme. So there's synergies with the scheme decarbonisation objectives. And more broadly, by doing this, we're hoping that we'll improve the carbon literacy of the heat network supply chain. So we'll more broadly help and support you guys to understand carbon emissions, how they work, how you can measure them and how you can reduce them. Just a few things to note for the session. As I said previously, the session is going to be recorded. Please keep your camera off unless you're speaking. Please keep your microphone muted unless you're speaking. And if you could put any questions that you have in the chat, at least while Megan and Chris are presenting, that would be great. We'll try and answer those at the end, and then we can take hands up for questions at the end if there are any. So why are we here? Why are we talking about Scope 1 and 2 emissions? So most of you told us that about 50% of you told us that you were only somewhat familiar with Scope 1 and 2 emissions, and a small proportion of you told us that you weren't confident at all, and 50% of you said that you were between neutral and extremely not confident in your understanding of quantifying Scope 1 and 2 emissions. So that seemed like a logical place for us to start. You also told us you were really interested in learning more about target setting in line with science-based targets. And so that seemed like a really obvious place to kind of group those two together. You'll note too that Scope 1 and 2 emissions usually come with Scope 3 emissions, and we will refer to those in today's session, but we will do a separate session, and we intend to do a separate session focusing exclusively on Scope 3 emissions, because understanding of Scope 3 emissions is much lower and confidence is much lower in your understanding. So we'll come back to you and offer another session to build on this one to cover Scope 3 emissions. So this is sort of generally the approach. This is why we're here. This is what this is sort of what we're going to take you through today: Scope 1 and 2 and measuring and reporting. So without further ado, I will hand over to Chris for the next part of his presentation.
Thanks, Rob. Hi all. I'm going to start by running through some kind of context, some key definitions, a little bit of terminology around carbon emissions and carbon accounting. Some of that will probably be lately familiar to you all in terms of what Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions are, but I think it's just good to set the scene in terms of context, and then a little bit of policy. And then what I'll do is I'll focus on kind of a project example around carbon footprint and carbon accounting for a single building, or for an estate-wide approach that you might want to use or implement to kind of look at the carbon emissions of a single asset or multiple assets. So in terms of key definitions, just to kind of recap on what some of these are. So scope 1 emissions are greenhouse gas emissions that are directly from your operations. That's typically from the generation of fossil fuels on site. So that might be gas boilers, it might be NOx emissions that are associated with combustion, and other things around GHGs. Scope 2 emissions are generally from generation of purchased and consumed electricity, steam, heat, or cooling. So if you're, for example, in the context of HNES, if you're buying bulk heat to your site, that is a scope 2 emission, because you're buying in, you're not directly responsible for the generation of the fossil fuels. So they would fall under scope 2 emissions for that asset. Likewise, scope 3 emissions, they're indirect emissions, which are typically associated with your supply chain, so the transport of goods and materials to a construction site, for example, and other elements within your value chain. Carbon dioxide, without going into too much detail, is the gas that we're all referring to when we talk about attributed carbon emissions. Carbon accounting is the process of verifying, measuring, and monitoring how much greenhouse gases and how much carbon we emit from processes as an organization, or for different policies and processes within our businesses and organizations. Carbon equivalent, so CO2e, is the most commonly used metric measure for CO2, and it's how we compare that against the global warming potential of other greenhouse gases, such as methane and such as nitrous oxide. Next slide, please, Will. Yeah. I won't go through all these additional definitions in detail, but they're probably concepts that you've come across. But in no particular order, kind of greenhouse gases, when we're talking about GHGs, it's the group of gases which are most commonly attributed to global warming and climate change. So carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, for example, and NOx and SOx, for example, are some of the ones that we'll discuss. The carbon footprint is the measurement used to quantify carbon impacts within a typical business. Embodied carbon is the carbon emissions that are associated through a manufacturing process, transport, or storage of stuff. And then one that we've probably all heard is the operational carbon. So that's the in-use carbon emissions of a building. So if you've got gas boilers, if you've got electricity within your building, there will be an associated operational carbon for that building. And whole life carbon is something that's becoming more and more of a familiar term within the construction sector, which is kind of the whole life cost and whole life carbon now come together as part of life cycle assessments and LCAs for the whole life carbon of a building. So the embodied carbon, the carbon emissions that are associated with materials that are put in that building, but then also the operational carbon and the carbon associated with the decommissioning of that asset or that building. And then other common terms that we'll typically say are carbon offsetting, so that's carbon credits, where you can kind of offset your own carbon emissions by buying kind of verified credits. That's generally associated with either carbon capture and storage or the planting of trees, for example, and reforestation. And then the other bits we've got are net zero carbon, carbon negative, and zero carbon, which are all very similar phrases, but have slightly different definitions in terms of what we're looking at. So when we're looking at 2030, 2035, 2040, and potentially 2050 targets, we're typically talking about net zero carbon. And then when we're talking about carbon negative, not many of these organizations at present, that's where you've actually reached your net zero goals already, and potentially you might be carbon positive. In terms of why carbon emissions are so important in terms of how we account for greenhouse gases, in terms of how we set targets, and in terms of how we set buildings. Everything currently is driven through the UK Climate Change Act, where we have got a national mandate to try and achieve net zero by 2050. And appreciate within the public sector and within the private sector, lots of organisations have set more ambitious targets to either reach net zero by 2030 or reduce kind of scope 1 emissions to to zero by kind of 2030, 2035. So as a country, we're looking at net zero by 2050. We're currently not on track for that. That doesn't mean that other organisations across the UK aren't currently achieving those targets or kind of set to meet those targets. But actually, we're in 2024. We've got 26 years to 2050, so there's a lot to do over the course of the next 2-3 decades in terms of getting us there as a nation. In terms of the greenhouse gas protocol, so the greenhouse gas protocol is an international protocol in terms of how we define greenhouse gases. Typically, when we do talk about greenhouse gases, we do focus on carbon because that's the measurement by which we kind of we look at traditionally. But GHG does also include the accounting, the monitoring, the verification of other things like methane, nitrous oxide, sometimes water vapor, and then sulfurous oxides as well, for example. And what it makes us look at is makes us look at the CO2 emissions from kind of non-fossil fuels, biomass fuels, and any kind of combustion-based mechanism that contributes to carbon emissions. Likewise, kind of the electricity grid and how carbon intensive or how dirty or clean that is in regards to the amount of renewables on the grid. There are a couple of different measures within the greenhouse gas protocol by which we can essentially assess our carbon emissions and assess our greenhouse gases. One is through direct measurement, so that is by far the most accurate way to do it, but not all organisations that do that. And that's through essentially continuous emission monitoring. This involves kind of metering and kind of measurement of the accuracy and kind of the verification of carbon emissions, methane and the other GHGs, and that's typically more associated with kind of big polluters, so sites that are either power stations or industrial scale level. When we're talking about greenhouse gas protocol for kind of organizations and business levels that aren't industrialized, typically what we're doing is we're doing kind of a mass balance approach where we're looking at the carbon intensity, the carbon content of different fuels to determine our emissions, and we're doing that through kind of the energy that we consume or the energy outputs that we have as an organization. So just to give you a little bit of context of where we are and how we've kind of got to 2024, appreciate the graph on the right just goes to 2020. We used to be really carbon intensive before we had a national gas grid, and that's because we burnt a lot of coal. And then from the 1990s, there was a kind of a decarbonisation in the UK's electricity grid because we got rid of a lot of coal-fired power stations and started using natural gas, which is less carbon intensive than coal. And then we plateaued for a few years in terms of there wasn't a lot of renewable intensity on the grid. There was kind of a boom in offshore wind kind of in the early millennium, and kind of wind and solar and biomass have become a lot more dominant at grid scale levels rather than kind of the small microgrids that we saw in the noughties. So currently what we've got is we've got a big investment in renewable energy happening for the electricity grid, and that is decarbonising, is forecast to decarbonise over time towards 2050. There is an uncertainty about what will happen with the gas grid. So the gas grid, in terms of forecast, HNES produce a quality forecast in terms of carbon intensity of the grid. The gas grid essentially plateaus out until 2030 and 2050. That might change with the introduction of hydrogen blends, which will see the carbon intensity of the grid reduce. However, there's no certainty and there's no timeline in terms of green hydrogen becoming kind of fully commercialized for that. So just to give you an overview of how these emissions kind of interact. So scope 1, scope 2, in terms of you as a business or you as an organization. If you've got a building and you're burning fossil fuels, that's direct emissions. That's something you own and something you can completely control. That accounts to your scope 1 emissions. If you've got company vehicles, and they might run on biofuel, they might run on diesel, they might run on petrol, you might have some fleet EVs that are coming in as well. They also contribute to your direct carbon emissions. Scope 2 emissions, again, are those emissions that are indirectly associated with your organisation. So that's electricity that you purchase from somewhere else, something that you purchase from the grid. So you will either be purchasing your electricity direct from an energy supplier, which may or may not be 100% green. There are 100% green tariffs out there now, so you can reduce your scope 2 emissions that way. And then finally, scope 3 emissions again are your kind of upstream and downstream emissions that are associated with your supply chain and your value chain in the goods and services that you choose to procure. I'm going to focus in a little bit more in terms of built assets and how we look at buildings and how we could look at estates in terms of decarbonisation. This is typically quite a well-trodden path in terms of what's on the screen right now. Insofar as organisations really to get a good and accurate carbon footprint, we need to understand what our baseline is. So we need to collect data in terms of our energy consumption. So whether that's electricity, whether that's gas, whether that's kind of fuel burnt through biomass or through biofuels. It could be diesel generation if your main business is construction, for example, and you're using a lot of on-site generation. And you really need to understand what that data is, how accurate it is, and where it comes from. And what we really need is a full year or a few years worth of data to be able to benchmark and assess where we are compared to where we were, but also just to help us kind of normalise what our consumption patterns are. So one of the key things around that will be organisations actually trying to benchmark and look at their carbon footprint post-COVID, where we're in a slightly different occupancy levels in terms of buildings and in terms of normal working. If we're looking at a built asset, the first thing to do is one of the things that we look at as part of HNES is improving operational efficiency. What are the low cost or no cost measures that we can do and implement to ensure that actually the assets that we've got are controlled effectively and they're being maintained effectively. So if we're looking at plant preventive maintenance, for example, or if we're looking at just changing controls based on occupancy and demand of a system. The next kind of pragmatic element is to look at kind of what can we upgrade, what is maybe inefficient or ineffective currently. So that might be to do with pumps and fans and moving away from mechanical motors and moving to kind of electric speed drives, for example. And then the other element of that is also kind of what can we do to reduce the demands, because ultimately all of our buildings are always going to want to use energy. We're always going to have some kind of energy demand, so there is a carbon emission associated with that until we are able to electrify and reduce that carbon intensity of that fuel to zero. And then the last thing, which is kind of the further ambition, is kind of the removal of scope 1 emissions entirely, fossil fuel generation. So what fossil fuel generation that we've got in our control can we reduce, can we get rid of? That might be by moving over to kind of a transition period where we've got lower carbon intensity fuels. We're moving from gas to biomethane, for example, or we're moving from a gas boiler over to something like an electric heat pump, which is essentially as carbon intensive as the grid. So if you're buying 100% renewable electricity, your heat pump, your carbon emissions are 100% electrical and 100% associated with the grid. And finally, if we want to go that step further, we can look at renewable generation. So can we have something like solar PV or solar thermal or battery storage that helps us to balance our demands and reduce our demands on site. But then also that gives us a view on whether we can be a net exporter in terms of electricity, which might help other businesses decarbonise in a microgrid scenario. In terms of best practice, in terms of kind of delivering decarbonisation for an asset or for an organisation, there's a few well-trodden paths in terms of what HNES have set out, what organisations like Salix Finance set out around decarbonisation and the funding of decarbonisation projects. It's to look at you as an organisation. What are you doing? What are your ambitions? Have you set objectives around a climate emergency or something that ilk, or your targets of 2050 or the earlier? What are the steps that you as an organisation might have to go through? But also, what have you already done? What technologies have you got maturity in? What are you less mature in? Where do risks lie, for example? And then you do what we just described before in terms of building that baseline, collecting that data, and understanding what your normal carbon footprint for your normal operations are. And then you can then start to be more ambitious and look at the reduction of your carbon emissions, but kind of your energy consumption. What can you reduce? What systems do you always need? What systems may you not need, and how can you refine those and make those more efficient? And then the next element is kind of looking at your physical challenges, your technical challenges, and the cost associated with those, and how they might align with your capital budgets and projects that you've already got ongoing. And the next final stage is we're kind of looking at how you might deliver that. Is there a phased approach for that? For example, we know with a lot of heat networks, they are bigger pieces of infrastructure. They do take longer to get into the ground to build out. Likewise, so do the upgrade works. So you might have to focus on your delivery plan and kind of the risks around that in terms of when you might be able to access funding and how you can take things forward. And then the final element is looking at what can you pay for by yourself as an organisation, where you might find grant funding, where you might get private finance, and where you might be able to access other grants and loans. So that's really where the HNES scheme comes in terms of kind of trying to find those opportunities and match those opportunities in terms of an organisation. What is the right fit for you in terms of what grant funding you require. This is just to give you a brief picture of where we are in terms of the electricity grid. So as I said, the electricity grid's been decarbonised over time because we've got a lot of renewables coming out of the grid, mainly from offshore wind and mainly from large scale solar, but there is a mix of hydro and onshore wind there. And I think we'll probably see more hydro and more onshore wind coming into play in the next decade. So generally, if you're able to electrify a building or electrify a process or asset, by 2050, you should be nearly there. There should only be a small fraction left for you to offset, which is why typically kind of heat networks led by heat pumps, whether that's an air source, a water source, or a ground source, are seen as kind of a viable option to move this forward. Next slide, Will. Likewise, this is just to show you what an organisation might do. So the business as usual line is based on an organisation who has fossil fuel generation and is going to continue with that for any number of reasons, but they're going to make incremental steps in terms of improving their efficiency and reducing their carbon emissions. But if they don't get rid of fossil fuels, they're still going to have quite significant carbon emissions associated with that generation. The light blue line shows what happens essentially from 2023 to 27. That's an organisation removing its fossil fuel generation and then continuing on a downward trajectory out to 2040 with an electrified system. I think that's the final slide, Will. This is just to show you how you might actually decarbonise an asset. So you might be doing this as part of HNES in terms of complementary works. The water source heat pump element might be where you're decarbonising your network, but actually what you've done as part of that process is look at all the other building efficiency measures that you might implement to reduce the carbon emissions of the building. But then at the end on the far right, you've still got a little bit that you need to either rely on offsets for or look at further on site generation. I think sorry, that wasn't the final slide. This is the final slide before I hand over to Megan. This is just to demonstrate that there's quite a few standards and certifications around net zero and kind of compliance and minimum standards that you can't implement as an organisation or align to as an organisation to take forward. So things to look out for are UKGBC. They've got a lot of guidance on net zero, the net zero buildings framework. They've got a lot on commercial buildings, for example. LETI have done a lot of good work in terms of minimum U value requirements and minimal heat loss standards. And then what Megan will take us on to is science-based targets initiative and how we align with that. That's it from me. So thanks for listening.
Thanks, Chris. I will hand over to Megan, and what I suggest we do, if we've got any questions in the chat that have come up throughout, then we can take those all at the end, but I want to make sure we cover the content in time. So I'll move us along and hand over to you, Megan.
Thank you very much. All right, so just to begin, why should your company set reduction targets of the Science-Based Target Initiative? So the SBTI initiative are one of the leading target methodologies. So there are other target methodologies out there. However, the SBT is cross-sectoral. So science-based targets help companies ensure that they're doing what is required when it comes to emission reductions aligned with the climate science. So they're considered the gold standard for corporate climate action. So just to give some context behind that, the SBTI was initially shaped by the Paris Agreement. So this was signed in 2016, and it's considered a landmark event for the planet as it aims to avoid climate change and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So by limiting to 1.5 degrees, we can help reduce the impacts of climate change on human systems, terrestrial, freshwater, and coastal ecosystems. So it's important to note that any targets that have to align with either a 1.5 degree scenario, as you can see on the top there, or a well below 2 degree scenario. This is because the targets are set in line with the most current climate science, and this is necessary to be able to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So just to note at the bottom there that there did used to be a 2 degree scenario, but this is no longer relevant due to the pressing nature of the agreement. So as a company, why should you set reduction targets of SBT? Well, it makes business sense. So SBT reduction targets can help companies to future-proof growth. You can help save money through improving efficiencies by helping to meet the targets. They also help provide resilience against climate risk, which is becoming a more prevalent issue. Also boosting investor confidence. So many investors now are looking into whether or not companies have set SBT targets. And then also helping companies increase internal innovation and competitiveness in the market. So it helps provide a clear vision that's scientifically aligned to where your company needs to be, and can also help challenge your company to transform your business practices, and thus allowing you to play a role in creating a low carbon economy. So companies from all around the world and across sectors can set science-based targets. So on the right here, we can see a breakdown of the different types of companies by industry. So you can see the approved targets and commitments. So most applicable for our audience today will be the services and infrastructure sector. So they're already leading the way forward with their ambitious commitments. And it's important to note that there are sector-specific SBTI guidance. So for example, for some attendees today, the buildings guidance might be applicable. So we're currently going through the generic cross-sectoral approach to SBT, but there will be particular guidance documents that can apply. And I put links to these documents in the concluding slide. And then just on the left-hand side there, the coverage of geographic reach of SBT. So this is the most current one that we could find from 2022. But as you can see that there's 54% there in Europe. So what is the process for setting science-based targets? So it's a fairly straightforward process. So you've got committing, developing, submit, communicate, and disclose. So to commit, as a company, you will register online and you will send a letter to SBTI stating your company's commitment to set a target. So once accepted, you have 2 years from this point to get a target developed, validated, and published. And then for the developing stage, before developing the target, you should have a greenhouse gas inventory ready to go. So making sure that that greenhouse gas inventory aligns with all the appropriate guidance, and then as set out in the target validation protocol. And then the next stage will be to submit. So from here on, you will submit your targets to the SBT. So you'll use the right submission form and the relevant guidance. It should be submitted together with any supporting evidence that you have. And then the review process will take approximately 30 days, although there are some delays now since COVID. And then the next stage is to communicate. So once your target is approved, you then have up to 6 months to communicate the target to the public. And then as with any target, it's important to monitor and disclose. So your organization would then be required to disclose emissions annually and monitor progress on reaching the targets. So there are different ways that you can do this, including CDP disclosure, annual reports, sustainability reports, or even on your own company's website. So what are the target setting options available for SBTI? So you've got near-term, long-term targets, and net zero targets. So near-term targets play a crucial role in companies' efforts to combat climate change. So these targets focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions over the next 5 to 10 years. So in this section, we'll delve into the key components of net zero targets for Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. So near-term targets for Scope 1 and 2 typically look at a reduction of at least 42% relative to the base year emissions. So for example, if the year you calculated your baseline was 2020 and your target year is 2030, then you would need to reduce by at least 4.2% minimum each year. So there are three components to a near-term target for Scope 1 and 2. So this looks at the carbon budget, which is a finite amount of carbon that can be emitted into the atmosphere before warming will exceed specific thresholds. And then we've also got the emission scenario. So this represents a way of distributing the available carbon budget over time. And then we also have the allocation approach. So for Scope 1 and 2, this is either absolute contraction, sectoral decarbonisation, or renewable energy. Similarly, for a near-term target for Scope 3, the previous would apply, but the allocation approach will change. So we'll go over the allocation methods in more on the next slide, but to include Scope 3 emissions in a net zero target, they must cover at least 2/3, so that's at least 67% of total reported and excluded Scope 3 emissions. A Scope 3 target also has a different minimum reduction, so this will be 25%, which would then be a 2.5% per annum reduction per year by 2030 if you had a 2020 baseline. And then also on the right here, we've got long-term targets. So these targets refer to targets which are longer than 5 to 10 years away, but before 2050. So it's important to note that only 5 to 10% of emissions can be offset at the end of long-term targets. And then for a net zero target, so a net zero target has to include Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. So the majority of companies that set net zero targets will have to do extensive decarbonisation of around 90 to 95%. So both near and long-term targets must be set in order to set a net zero target with SBT. So we talked about the different target setting methodologies previously. So these are all the different methods that you have available for setting a reduction target with SBT. So firstly, we have the absolute contraction approach. So this approach is a cross-sector absolute reduction. So this is a method for setting absolute targets that uses contraction of absolute emissions. So through this approach, companies can reduce absolute emissions at the same rate, irrespective of the initial emissions performance. Then we've also got sectoral decarbonisation. So this is a method for setting physical intensity targets. So it focuses on reducing emissions relative to specific business metrics. So for example, production output, so measured in tons of CO2e per ton of product produced. You've also got renewable energy. So this one can only cover Scope 2. So this means you have to set another target for Scope 1, but typically companies will set a Scope 1 and Scope 2 target at the same time. Then we've also got physical intensity. So a physical intensity target can focus on reducing emissions per unit of production. So in other words, it aims to reduce emissions relative to specific business metrics, such as the amount of product manufactured or produced. And then we've also got economic intensity. So an economic intensity target focuses on reducing emissions per value added. And finally, supplier engagement. So supplier engagement target can be set to help drive reduction behaviours that benefit other customers at the same time. So for example, requiring your suppliers to set science-based targets. So just on the next two slides, these are just going to be a couple examples of what these targets can look like. So Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3. So on the left-hand side here, we have an absolute contraction target. So this covers 100% of Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. So for example, if your base year is 2022 and you're wanting to cover Scope 1 and 2, so you go from 750 tonnes of CO2e with a reduction of 42%. So that's at least 4.2% per annum. And then for 2030, you would get to 435 tonnes of CO2e. So on the top there, you can see you've got scenario 1, which is a 1.5 degree alignment. And then on scenario 2, you've got 2050, so a net zero. And then for Scope 3, so on the left-hand side again, we've got an absolute contraction. So that covers Scope 3 for near-term targets. So there is an option to do a 1.5 degrees as well as well below 2 degrees aligned. So again, for a 2022 baseline, you've got 7,000 tonnes of CO2e. And then in 2030, you'll have a 1.5 degree target, and then you'll be reducing to 4,060 tonnes of CO2e. So this is one of the most important parts with SBT, so communication and disclosure. So the way SBT asks companies to communicate their targets are very specific. So this is to provide clarity and accountability for companies. So on the bottom there, you can see some example target statements. So for example, company A commits to reduce absolute Scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas emissions 50.7% by 2030 from a 2019 base year. And then company A can also commit to reduce absolute Scope 3 greenhouse gas emissions from business travel by 27.5% by 2030 from a 2019 base year. So that's one of the categories for Scope 3. and that 60% of the suppliers by emissions impact covering purchased goods and services will have science-based targets by the financial year 2028. So again, another Scope 3 category. So ideally for Scope 3, you'd want to have more than 67% just coverage, just for that buffer in case you're unable to meet the target for whichever reason. And then again, it's important to make sure that you do disclosure and monitoring. So after communicating your target, you'll be required to keep up with disclosing progress made against the target. So I guess I mentioned previously, you can do this through CDP, annual reports, and your own company's website. So just about taking the next step on your climate journey of SBT. So here we have 7,510 companies that have taken action so far, and 4,599 of these have now set science-based targets. So it's a very successful initiative. So these companies have joined SBT knowing that SBT is grounded in the latest scientific evidence and that they align with the global goal of limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. And what we're seeing now is that companies are part of the value chain. They are expecting their suppliers to be on a similar journey. So it's being demanded by the clients and stakeholders in the value chain that these companies set SBTs. So it's important to remember that science-based targets not only contribute to global climate goals, but they also future-proof the viability of your business. So by taking ambitious climate action, your company can help lead the way towards a more sustainable and resilient future. And on the right-hand side here, we have a list of resources, so feel free to go through these. And then at the bottom, we've also got the building-specific guidance that I mentioned earlier. Fab, thank you very much.